Michael Schumacher, a man who needs no introductions when it comes to Formula 1 fans. A man who, after the tragedy of Ayrton Senna in 1994, carried the sport on his back for many years to come, with him winning 7 world championships during that time, and also in some ways revolutionising the idea of what it took to be the best from a competitive and fitness standpoint. Although the man had his flaws, and was often his worst enemy at times, there's no doubting that the man left a legacy in the sport, with some still proclaiming to this day that he is the greatest driver to ever grace the sport. So you can imagine when he made his return in 2010, a lot of the same fans were absolutely hyped to see if he still had what it took to compete against the best. But unfortunately, his return to Formula 1 in 2010 was seen as a massive failure, with some even suggesting that his return to the sport tarnished the incredible legacy he had previously. This is the story of Michael Schumacher's failed return in the early 2010s. It's the 2006 Italian Grand Prix, a race which would see Michael Schumacher take his 90th career win after a strategic masterclass to beat the McLaren of Kimi Raikkonen, with Robert Kubica in the BMW Sauber picking up his first ever podium in only his 3rd Grand Prix, after replacing the Terminator Jacques Villeneuve. His victory in Monza would end up being significant for 2 reasons. One being that he was able to slash the points deficit between himself and his rival that year, Fernando Alonso, to just 2 points as a result of the Spaniard retiring from a guaranteed place on the podium due to an engine failure that he sustained with just 11 laps to go. And the other reason why this win would end up being significant is because of what would happen at the post-race press conference once the podium ceremony had come to a close.
This is going to be my last Monza race I'm going to do. At the end of this year, I've decided together with the team that I'm going to retire from racing.
There have been a lot of conspiracy theories suggesting what may have led to this decision, but regardless of how and why it came to be, the upshot of it was this. After the checkered flag was raised at the final race in Brazil, Michael was going to be bowing out after 16 years of being in the sport, and with only 3 races to go, he had only one target on his mind before he bid farewell: win an 8th world title and retire at the top. That's technically 2 things, but let's not get pedantic about this. Whilst it initially looked like it was going his direction, with him winning the next race in China to take the lead in the standings on a countback, a cruel retirement from the lead at Suzuka with 17 laps to go, combined with a fuel feed problem and a puncture in both qualifying and the race at the finale, would see him fail his objective, with him losing the championship to Fernando in the end by just 13 points. But even with this failure, Michael would still leave the sport on a high note, as after sustaining a puncture after contact with Alonso's teammate Giancarlo Fisichella, he would perform an amazing comeback drive, picking off places one by one to finish the race in 4th place, proving to the world why he won 7 world championships. With him having a final race he could be proud of, Michael could spend the rest of his life being with his family and enjoyed a well-earned retirement by putting his feet up, with his chapter in Formula 1 coming to a satisfying close. Or so we thought. During the early years of his retirement, Michael would stay on at Ferrari to become the company's official brand ambassador. But not only that, he would also become one of the official test drivers for the F1 team, with him taking part in some official testing sessions where, unsurprisingly, even with his time off, would still perform some very competitive lap times. And with his role of being one of the team's official test drivers, it meant that he was often on standby in case anything happened to one of Ferrari's main drivers. And in 2009, when Felipe Massa had his horrifying accident during qualifying for the Hungarian Grand Prix, Ferrari initially chose Michael to be the one to replace Felipe for however long the Brazilian would be out for, which later turned out to be the rest of the season. But unfortunately for Michael, he wouldn't be able to fulfill that role, as a motorcycle accident earlier in the year, whilst doing a private test for a German superbike team, left him with an injured neck, and as a result, despite his best efforts to get himself fit for Valencia, was forced to cancel his plans to return to Formula 1 for the remainder of that year, with Luca Badoer taking on the role instead, only for him to be replaced by fellow compatriot Giancarlo Fisichella due to poor performances in the 2 races that he competed in. Even with this setback though, Michael wanting to replace Massa in the first place proved that he was still hungry for a return to Formula 1, and realising that it wasn't going to be with Ferrari, given both of those seats had been taken by Massa and his 2006 rival Fernando Alonso, Michael would instead look for other opportunities to try and get himself back on the grid. And luckily for the 7-time world champion, that opportunity would present itself, as when Mercedes purchased 75% of the Brawn GP team at the end of 2009, they were looking to have an all-German lineup for their first year back as a fully fledged manufacturer team, following Jenson Button's decision to join Lewis Hamilton at McLaren. The team would first sign Nico Rosberg from Williams, in essentially a swap move with Rubens Barrichello, who had gone in the other direction, and the team were initially keen on having Nick Heidfeld partner alongside him, as a result of Mercedes' German rivals BMW pulling out of the sport at the end of the previous year. But when they heard that Michael was wanting to return to Formula 1 in 2010, Mercedes, who had had a previous relationship with him in sports cars, couldn't resist saying no, and combined with the fact that their team principal Ross Brawn had also had a relationship with Michael during their time at both Benetton and Ferrari, the team were able to snap him up for 2010, with him signing a 3-year contract with the team with the aim of trying to win an 8th world title during that time. After 3 years out of the sport, Michael was officially back, and with him joining the team that won the championship the previous year, there was a lot of hype surrounding the partnership, with many expecting him to take the fight to the likes of Hamilton and Vettel, both of whom he had never raced with before, particularly Sebastian, who had grown up hero worshipping Michael during his karting days. But unfortunately, that expectation would turn sour when the first race of the season arrived in Bahrain. After doing a test in a GP2 car at Jerez earlier in the year to get himself prepared for the season ahead, many expected Michael to fight from the off, considering the team that he was with went into the year as the reigning champions. But during pre-season testing, it became clear that the Mercedes, which was essentially an updated version of the 2009 Brawn GP car, was not up to speed compared to their rivals, with the team deciding to hold back on any major updates until the first race of the 2010 season. And by the time the first race did arrive, it initially looked like the updates had worked, with Michael ending the second practice session in 3rd place, whilst teammate Rosberg ended up topping the timing sheets, with only Hamilton splitting the 2 Mercs. But when it came to qualifying, that was a completely different story, as with everyone turning up the wick, it became clear that Mercedes were nowhere near the front runners, with Rosberg qualifying in 5th, whilst Michael was just under 3/10 behind Nico and a row behind in 7th, with the pair being over a second behind the Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel, who had grabbed the first pole position of the season. The pair would initially get off to a good start in the race, with both gaining a place at the start and essentially putting Lewis into a Mercedes sandwich. But the back end of the race would see their pace fall away, with the pair ending up finishing the race in 5th and 6th, with Nico having the upper hand on Michael come the checkered flag. But even despite this drop-off, combined with the fact that Michael had not raced in the sport since 2006, it was a decent performance on his comeback. But the next 3 races would see Michael only score 2 points, with him being forced to make a recovery drive in Australia due to a first lap collision with Alonso and Button, whilst China would see him struggle with a lack of pace during the changeable conditions. In between those 2 races, Michael would have his first retirement since his return, thanks to a loose wheel nut caused by a failure, on the same weekend that his teammate Rosberg would grab the team's first ever podium, which he would promptly follow up with another podium finish at China, in a race which he led the majority of. This, as a result, put Michael 40 points behind his teammate in the standings, who, thanks to his 2 consecutive podiums, managed to get himself up to second and only 10 points behind championship leader at the time, Jenson Button. Not a great start to his return, but the only way was up from here, right? Well, sadly for Michael, that wasn't the case. You see, whilst he was able to bounce back at the next race in Spain, with him grabbing a 4th place finish following Lewis Hamilton's crash with 2 laps to go, the following race would see him finish down in 12th, following a time penalty he would receive for overtaking Alonso on the last lap after the safety car came in. And that would kind of be the story of Michael throughout the entirety of 2010, as one good result, like another 4th place finish he got in Turkey, once again taking advantage of a dramatic incident that happened in front, would then be followed by a consistent run of poor results, which when compared to his teammate Rosberg, who would end up grabbing another podium at Silverstone, didn't make for grim readings in the Drivers' Championship, as whilst Nico would end up finishing up in 7th, being 2 points behind the underperforming Felipe Massa, Michael would finish 2 places behind in 9th, being 70 points adrift of his younger teammate, with the Renault of Robert Kubica splitting the pair of them. Considering the expectation that surrounded Michael and the team heading into 2010, it was a disappointing season by all accounts, with the only thing that people remembered from Michael that year being the controversial incident he had with former teammate Rubens Barrichello at Hungary when he shoved the Brazilian towards the pit wall. But with 2 years left on his contract, there was still enough time to turn the misfortune of 2010 around, and with the 2011 car being the first to have Mercedes influence, given the 2010 car, as mentioned earlier, was intended to be a Brawn GP car, things in theory could only get better. Keywords in theory, because truth be told, it wasn't. Compared to 2010, their start to the season was weaker, with both Nico and Michael retiring from the first race in Australia due to damage caused by separate incidents, whilst Malaysia would see Michael grab the team's first points of the season, albeit a disappointing 9th. And while Mercedes was struggling, Renault, who had been rebranded as Lotus Renault at this point, hence why the team were registered as a British team, got off to a flying start, with both Vitaly Petrov and Nick Heidfeld, who came in as a late replacement for the injured Robert Kubica, grabbing podiums in the first 2 races, with it initially looking like that the team had overtaken Mercedes in the pecking order. Luckily for Mercedes, this wouldn't last too long, as Renault, thanks in part to Kubica sadly being out of action, would end up going backwards as the season progressed, not helped by the fact that Heidfeld was unfairly let go after Hungary to make way for Bruno Senna. Despite this though, Mercedes were not able to grab a podium during the season, making it another year that Michael wouldn't spray the champagne. But nevertheless, the middle part of the year would see Michael demonstrate that he still had remnants of his prime self. At Spa, which would end up marking the 20th anniversary of his debut, with him commemorating a gold helmet to celebrate this, Michael, after crashing out in qualifying due to a loose wheel, would charge his way through the order to finish in a brilliant 5th place, even overtaking his teammate Rosberg in the closing stages. Then, at Monza, following a first lap crash caused by the out-of-control Vittorio Liuzzi, which even took out Michael's teammate, Schumi, after the safety car was brought in, was able to blast past Hamilton down the pit straight to move up into 3rd, leading to a lengthy battle between the two, even after Jenson would pass the pair of them, as a result of Lewis setting his gearbox incorrectly. Lewis would eventually pass Michael as a result of the German receiving a warning for excessive weaving, but even despite that, Michael would still finish the race in a strong 5th, delivering the maximum the car was capable of. 2 more strong results at Japan and the first ever Indian Grand Prix would allow Michael to finish the year in 8th place, still finishing behind Rosberg, but a lot closer to him than he was in 2010, with him finishing 13 points behind instead of 70. With Michael appearing to have the upper hand on Nico in the second half of the season, and with Mercedes bringing in a lot of innovative designs, including a hybrid version of the F-duct on the nose tip, known as the W-duct, which later formed the basis for the double DRS system that would be implemented the following year, things looked to finally be on the up for both Mercedes and Michael. But 2012, which ironically was when Michael's contract with Mercedes would expire, would end up not going the way the pair had intended. During testing, the team would end up tying with Williams for the most mileage, with their long runs raising eyebrows among many, even with them doing tests with both the 2011 and 2012 cars. And come the first race in Melbourne, it appeared the Silver Arrow had managed to turn a corner in their performance, as although they would only qualify in 4th and 7th, with Michael out-qualifying Nico this time around for the first race, the pair would have a lightning start, with both of them moving up to 3rd and 4th respectively, until Vettel overtook Rosberg later on in the lap. After that, Michael would get chased down by his younger protege, but before he had a chance to try and fend him off, his race would sadly come to an end on lap 10 when his gearbox seized up at turn 1, forcing him into the garage. The race would be made even worse for Merck when Rosberg, who was set for a P6 finish after Maldonado's last lap crash, would get a puncture after contact with Sergio Perez, leading to him finishing 12th and scoring himself and the team no points. A frustrating weekend after it promised so much, and it would end up being a similar story at the next race in Malaysia, as another strong qualifying for Michael, which saw him start 3rd behind the two McLarens, would end up going to waste on the first lap, as a collision with the Lotus of Romain Grosjean following a poor start would force the German into doing a recovery drive, which he would end up doing, but it would only be good enough for P10, whilst teammate Rosberg would have another frustrating race, finishing down in 13th. 2 races in, and Mercedes were cruelly not given the chance to demonstrate the raw speed of their car in race trim. But the next race in China would change all of that, as in qualifying, Mercedes would grab their first ever pole position, courtesy of Nico Rosberg, whilst Michael would qualify in 2nd, ensuring that the team secured their first ever front row lockout as well. And thanks to assistance from Michael, who held up the two McLarens of Button and Hamilton during the first stint, Rosberg was able to convert the pole and take his first ever Formula 1 win, with Mercedes taking their first win since 1955. After 2 years of struggle, Mercedes had finally made it to the top step of the podium again as a fully fledged manufacturer team. But whilst there were celebrations on Nico's side, the same couldn't be said for Michael, who thanks to a delayed pit stop, which allowed the two McLarens to jump him, would end up retiring a few corners later as a result of a loose wheel nut, which explained the reason for his delayed pit stop. The frustration from the first 3 races would then carry over into the next 2, as Michael would end up starting towards the back in Bahrain due to a DRS issue which knocked him out in Q1, combined with a gearbox change which gave him a grid penalty, with him once again being only able to recover to 10th, whilst in Spain, Michael, after only qualifying in 8th, would end his race on lap 12 as a result of a silly incident which he would cause at turn 1 with Bruno Senna, leading Michael to call Bruno an idiot on the team radio. 5 races down, and despite showing promise in those races, Michael had only scored 2 points, putting him 39 points behind teammate Rosberg, who despite a frustrating first 2 races, had managed to continue scoring points following his win at China. Nothing seemingly was going right for Schumi, but in Monaco, something amazing would happen, as on a track where Mercedes looked to be strong, Michael would do the unthinkable and grab his first pole position since France 2006, beating Mark Webber right to the death by only 800ths of a second, with Michael's facial expressions after quali showing how much it meant to him. For many fans, this was the moment that they had been waiting for ever since he made his return in 2010, and after 2 years of trying, Michael was finally going to start a race from pole position. Well, he would have done if he hadn't been given a 5-place grid penalty for his clash with Bruno at the previous race, making the moment of him topping qualifying just that, a moment, and making it one of the biggest what-ifs in the sport's history. But regardless of whether he had a grid penalty or not, it wouldn't have mattered anyway come race day, as like with the previous races, the Grand Prix would end up being a disaster, as along with contact with Romain Grosjean again on the first lap, which led to the Frenchman being tapped into a spin at turn 1, Michael would end up retiring from the race late on due to an issue with his fuel pressure, leaving him again with 0 points, whilst teammate Rosberg would grab another podium with second place after being involved in a 6-car scrap for the lead on the last lap, which would eventually be won by Webber. Canada wouldn't fare any better, as after qualifying down in 9th, Michael would once again retire from the race, this time due to an issue with his DRS as a result of the contraption failing when braking into turn 1, leaving the wing stuck open. With 5 retirements in the first 7 races, it felt like nothing was going right for Michael, especially given this coincided with Mercedes' drop-off in pace as the season went by, with the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari and even the rebranded Lotus team, which had the returning Kimi Raikkonen at the helm, being able to leapfrog them in the development race. At this point, the season felt like a write-off, with many even questioning at this point whether Michael would quit the sport at the end of the year. But undeterred, Michael, even in his early 40s at this point, was not going to throw in the towel just yet. He just needed one race to prove that he still had what it took to compete at the top level. And at the next race in Valencia, that's exactly what he would do. Starting down in 12th, in between the 2 Ferraris who also struggled, Michael, taking advantage of the chaos around him, would charge his way through the order, dragging Mark Webber with him in the process, who started all the way down in 19th to get himself up to 5th towards the back end of the race. At this point, it seemed like it was job done, and even if Michael didn't gain any more places at this point, it still would have been an amazing drive. But I said the words even if, so I think you know what happens next. In front of both Schumacher and Webber, Hamilton, after assuming second from the broken down Romain Grosjean, would struggle with a lack of grip in the latter stages of the race, allowing Grosjean's teammate Kimi Raikkonen to grab second place, and allowing the Williams of Pastor Maldonado to also close up onto Lewis with 2 laps to go. Heading into turn 12, and Maldonado would try a risky move around the outside of Lewis to try and grab the final podium spot. But in doing so, Pastor would end up going wide off the track, and with this being Maldonado, what do you think happened next? Yeah, Lewis got Maldonado'd. Again. Lewis would end up being out of the race, whilst Maldonado would limp the rest of the race without a front wing, allowing Michael to move up to 3rd and Webber to move up to 4th. At this point, there was a chance that Michael would grab his first podium since his return, but with Webber on his tail, it wasn't going to be easy heading into the final lap. As Alonso crossed the line to take an impressive win on home soil ahead of Raikkonen, the focus was now on who would grab the final podium spot. As the camera focused on the final corner, the silver arrow popped into view first and would cross the line in 3rd place. Michael had done it, even with a brief investigation for a yellow flag DRS infringement, which he was later cleared for. Michael, unbeknownst to him at the time, had finally grabbed that elusive podium on his return, and for many fans watching, this was a feel-good moment. And with the podium consisting of Alonso, Raikkonen and Schumacher, 3 men who defined an era during the early to mid 2000s, there was a sense of nostalgia as well. But for how good this moment was, Michael would have had to enjoy it while he could, because for the rest of the season, it was business as usual. Whilst the next 2 races would see Michael qualify very well, thanks in large to wet conditions affecting both sessions, the races would see the drop-off in Mercedes' pace come back to haunt him, as both races would see Michael finish down in 7th, whilst teammate Rosberg would struggle outside the points. Michael would then grab a couple more points finishes in Spa and Monza, following a mechanical issue in Hungary, but then would be involved in another silly accident in Singapore when he misjudged his braking at turn 14 and careered into the back of the Toro Rosso of Jean-Eric Vergne, ending both of their races in the process, with the pair being lucky to escape injury. It was around this weekend when rumours about his future would start to create more sound, especially when rumours started circulating, thanks to the late Eddie Jordan, that Mercedes were considering replacing Michael with Lewis Hamilton, who was starting to grow frustrated with his current team McLaren following numerous amounts of reliability issues from strong positions. And when Lewis would retire from the lead after another mechanical issue at Singapore, this would end up being the straw that broke the camel's back. And 5 days after the race had concluded, it was announced that Lewis would indeed be joining Mercedes from 2013, partnering alongside Nico Rosberg, leading to Checo to take his place at McLaren from Sauber, and leaving Michael out in the cold, with Mercedes essentially announcing that Michael would not be driving for the team the following season. This of course led to speculation that Michael would be heading into retirement again, and even though there were brief rumours that he could join Sauber in essentially a merry-go-round with Lewis and Checo, the former would end up coming true, as on the 4th of October 2012, 3 days before the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, it was announced that Michael would be hanging his racing gloves again at the end of the season. With Michael confirmed to be going back into retirement, he could enjoy the rest of the season without needing to put too much pressure on himself. But unfortunately for the German, he wouldn't get the happy send-off that he was craving for, as with Mercedes slipping into midfield territory by season's end, Michael would only grab one more points finish in the remaining 6 races, which came at his final race in Brazil, where he would finish in 7th place, giving his fellow compatriot Sebastian Vettel an extra place in the closing stages in order to aid his chances of winning a 3rd consecutive title. Michael in the end would finish the season in a dreadful 13th, finishing 44 points behind his teammate Rosberg, who even despite Mercedes' drop-off during the season, was still able to finish in the top 10 come season's end. And with that, Michael's 3-year stint back in Formula 1 had come to an end, and to put it quite bluntly, it was a total failure. Now look, let's not get it twisted. Mercedes during those 3 years did not produce a car that was capable of winning a world championship, and even when it looked like they had in 2012, the team would eventually drop off a cliff when teams around them started catching up and leapfrogging them in the pecking order. But even despite this, especially when comparing him to his teammate, it was very clear that Michael was not the same driver he used to be when he was dominating with the Ferrari Dream Team in the early 2000s. In the 3 years he had been out of the sport, he had lost his speed, and with him being in his early 40s, his decision making, along with his sharpness, had also started to dwindle as well, as proved with the accidents he had in 2012 with both Bruno Senna and Jean-Eric Vergne. Given what he had been brought in to do, it left a lot of his fans with a sour taste in their mouths, with many even arguing that his stint with Mercedes tarnished his incredible legacy somewhat. And whilst there were good moments like the drives he had in 2011, the pole position that never was at Monaco, and the podium he achieved at Valencia, the negatives throughout his time back in the sport sadly outweighed the good. That being said though, his return to F1 wasn't all for nothing, as thanks to his time at Ferrari, which allowed him to have an understanding of what it took to win, he was able to install a belief in the team that they were able to achieve big things, and with this mentality, combined with a strong work ethic, it would end up forming the foundation for what was to come when the new regulations were introduced in 2014, as in that year, Mercedes would go on to become the class of the field, and would continue to do so for many years to come, winning championship after championship, with both Lewis Hamilton, who would go on to equal Michael's tally of 7 world championships, and Nico Rosberg, who would win his only world championship in 2016 before doing an Alain Prost and retiring at the top. Sadly for Michael, he would never get to see this in first person, as his tragic skiing accident, which left him with brain injuries that he is still recovering from to this very day, happened before the 2014 season got underway. Even though his time driving for the team didn't go according to plan, his leadership skills would end up becoming crucial in the years after he retired, as the mentality he installed is still being used by the team to this very day, even during the barren spell the team is currently going through at the moment. and that is why for me, his time at Mercedes doesn't ruin his legacy, because if there's one thing that Michael's return to the sport should be remembered for, it should be for the role that he played in allowing Mercedes to become the dominant force for the majority of the V6 era.